Good morning. My name's Rachel Weaver. I am the sales manager for Old Republic Title here in the Portland metro area. I want to say thank you to all of you for being here. So some newer faces, some people that I've worked with for a really long time, and people that I'm just getting to know. So really appreciate that. As you know, on the title and escrow end, it takes a team. Actually, it takes a whole village, beginning with our real estate partners here. But I do want to take a moment to introduce my team here at Old Republic Title. So Kyle Warner, so can't miss him in a crowd. So, and we do have that on video, so that's a little scary. Sorry, Kyle. So appreciate him. He has been on the escrow side, but he is one of the most amazing teammates now on my sales team working out of the Clackamas office. So thank you, Kyle. So, and then two people that out of our Clackamas office that are escrow officers. As we all know, that is one of the paramount relationships in the transaction. So I want to introduce Janet Martin and Sherry Breck. We never like to talk about how long we have been in the industry, but I would say given this, I don't know, we're plus 50 years experience if we just, easy, we may, yeah. Yeah, so, we're here to talk about Oregon City and some of the wonderful things that they've been doing. And I do want to make sure Brad and Sean, they were the ones that are the catalysts behind us putting this class together with their relationship with Kay. So I do want to make sure to point that out and say thank you. An educated realtor or real estate partner is the best partner to have in this industry. And so you guys show a higher level of commitment just by being here. So thank you. Please talk this class up. We are having it recorded, so there will be the opportunity for people to watch it afterwards. And I'm sure that Akila could give us more information on that. I know for some people you've heard a lot of this, but I am kind of a fountain of fraud these days, and it's not necessarily something that I like to talk about in a positive manner, but it's something that we need to talk about in a proactive manner. So real estate fraud is happening right and left. So I have an example of something that just happened to a realtor partner. So they have this client. He went up to mow his lot in Vancouver. Well, guess what? He showed up and there was a for sale sign in it. So someone had impersonated him and was trying to sell his lot. So it does happen locally too. I know a lot of times we're like, oh, that happens to somebody else. But just as our real estate professionals and our partners, please, utilize some of the services that we can provide you. Whether you're going into ORTC online and pulling a trio. If you're having us do some extra research when, when the hairs on the back of your head kind of stand up and you're like, something's just off. We can call on some of our title partners and some of the people in our customer service department to do some additional research for you because we want you to be successful and we don't want anybody to be put in some of those situations. Another way, and I know this is kind of people get on me, like change your password, please, and make it long and strong. Characters, numbers, up or lower. We've had a couple of times where we've had people trying to fraudulently get wire instructions and they're changing things, and it's because they're hacking our realtors' emails. So please just remember that we can also, as professionals, be on the front line. With that, I guess I like this microphone, but I have to go. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Akila, and she's going to introduce you to our partners here who are going to be talking today. Thank you very much, everybody.
Welcome to Oregon City. Thank you for coming. We're excited to have you here today. I'm going to introduce some of our speakers and who we are. So Pete Walters, our planning manager. I've got a few things to say about each of us. And so he's been working for Oregon City since 2006. He's got a lot of extensive knowledge about the development process and natural resources. He's our liaison to our Natural Resource Committee. And he's done a lot of work developing regulations for residential, commercial development, and explaining all of our standards in an easy to understand way. So. And then next is me. I'm the Community Development Director, so I oversee building and planning. I've been here for about 2 years now, which is crazy, time flies. And before that, I was with City of Tualatin for about 13 years and then started out in Southern California and, for City of Torrance. And then next we've got Josh, and he is the Assistant City Engineer. He became a licensed professional engineer in the state of Oregon in 2014 and has worked in development, on the development side of engineering in Illinois, Wisconsin, and Oregon. And so Josh is going to talk about the geologic hazards. Pete will talk about natural resources and give kind of a land use high-level overview. And then Christina Robinson-Gardner, she's going to talk about our historic preservation and historic overlay. And so Christina's our senior planner. She's been with the city for over 22 years. She's a generalist, but she has a lot of knowledge in the historic area. And she also explains a lot of our regulations and standards in an easy-to-understand way. So can you advance that for me? Thanks. And then, so what we really want to talk about were these overlay districts. And part of the reason why we want to talk about that, and we're really glad that you're willing to learn about that, is that once people get into their property and learn that they have an overlay, it can really complicate things. And we don't want to scare anyone away from Oregon City, but we want people to be educated. And there are parts of our city that have multiple overlays, and it just kind of can make development a little bit more complicated. And it can also make a homeowner who wants to make some changes to their home just have to do some extra work. And so we wanted to make sure that people knew about that before they came to our counter and then realized they maybe got in too deep. So what an overlay is, well, let me follow what's on the agenda here. So we'll talk about natural resource overlay district, and then go into geologic hazards, and then the historic overlay district. And basically, it's a extra set of criteria that's on top of the base zone. So whether you're in a residential zone or a commercial or industrial zone, you may end up with one of these overlays on your zone that will kind of dictate where development can happen and how it can happen. But it can still happen. I think that's what I want to make sure that we drive home, is that it can still happen. It just maybe needs a little more creativity. So these three can be pretty technical and complicated. They do require some extra due diligence on the part of the property owner. And we are so happy to answer questions early in the process. We're so happy to help with due diligence all the time, because it makes everything smoother. Oregon City's really a great community with beautiful views and unique retail and dining. And we're the only place, I think, in the US that has a municipal elevator. We've got a really rich history, so there's some really unique things about Oregon City. And so that's what this session is about, is to just kind of talk through some of those unique opportunities. Let's see. So a couple of housekeeping things. So you saw the water and coffee, and then if you need restrooms, you'll go out the door and to your right, and you go almost to the exit, and then you'll see the restrooms on the right and the left. And like I mentioned, the mics are for the recording purposes. I'm not sure where we're going to post it yet. So what I will do is, once we get the link to the recording, I can send that to Rachel, and then she can make sure that everybody gets it, or whoever needs it. Same thing with the slides. We can make all the slides available because we've listed a number of different links and resources, and so I can send that out as well, and then she can make sure everybody gets it. Okay, and then we did reserve time at the end for questions. We will have time kind of in between if you've got questions for each piece, and then we'll have more time at the end for questions, so. All right, okay, so we're gonna start with Pete.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
All right, so I will trade places with you. So this first set is an overview, a very general overview of the land use and development approval process. Some of you may be very familiar with this if you've either gone through a process in Oregon City or any city in the metro area. Very similar processes. Ours has some efficiencies built in. I will tell you about those. Next slide, please. First, general overview of what the regulation framework is for planning in land use in Oregon. We have the Oregon statewide planning goals. Depending on whether you're on the coast or in the Portland metro area, these goals vary, but in general, they are the guiding document for how cities grow. We have to have a comprehensive plan that complies with state land use laws. Within the Portland metro area, as a metro city, Oregon City is also subject to the Urban Growth Functional Management Plan. And I didn't mention this, but we're also subject to the Metro Regional Transportation Plan, which is for our transportation system. And then we get into Oregon City's local municipal code, and we also have our comprehensive plan and map, which is the general land use categories. And then we have our zoning map and code, which is the more fine-grained regulations about permitted uses, conditional uses, and what's not allowed. Various public facilities plans, which Josh is in charge of implementing when you go through the land use process: water, sewer, stormwater, transportation and parks, public improvements requirements and standards, and then the building code, which applies to the building permit process. Next slide, please. So this is the basic framework for getting a permit all the way from what we call land use or planning approval to a final certificate of occupancy, whether it's residential or commercial. There's going to be a public improvement component, which Public Works reviews, and there's engineering specifications and standards associated with that. If you're required to build sidewalks in front of the development that you're doing, sewer, putting all that in the ground, that's Public Works and Josh's area. The building permit process for compliance with structural specialty code for residential or commercial development, that's through the building division, which is also in this department here. Then you get into construction of public improvements and construction of the development itself. And finally, certificate of occupancy. And we issue a certificate of occupancy when all of the prior requirements have been fulfilled. There is such a thing as a temporary certificate of occupancy if you still have work to do, and it can be issued through the building division. But I'm not going to get into the details of that. I was just like, so that's the basics. Next slide. We also have an Oregon City Municipal Code, which is where you would go to look for the zoning district classifications, anything to do with land division, buildings and construction, annexations, public services. Where planning mostly operates is in Title 16 and 17, which is the land division and zoning chapters. Zoning includes all classifications of the districts and the various processes that apply. Next slide. There's levels of land use review from the non-discretionary, over-the-counter stuff, which is very clear and objective, like the building code, or getting and I'll give you a couple examples of this, through the highly discretionary, which goes to the city commission and requires public notice and public hearings. And I'll go through each one of these briefly. Next slide. So the first one I'm going to talk about is type 1 review. These are technically not land use decisions. They are permits, but we have both commercial type 1 and residential type 1 applications. Sign permits are issued like a type 1. Some people call this administrative or ministerial decisions, but there's no discretion here. There's a lot of code and specifications and standards associated with it. If you meet them, we can issue that anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 to 4 weeks for some of the more complicated one. Next slide. So examples of type 1 residential application be a new home or an addition, adding a deck or an accessory structure. This is a really small one. We probably wouldn't even look at this, but 200 square feet or more accessory structure, we can even do as a type 1. Next slide. Then we have what we call type 1 non-residential permits, or type 1 minor site plan and design review, which applies to commercial projects or multifamily projects. These types of projects have already gone through a development review in the past. So you're making a change to an existing development that's already been approved. Examples would be changing windows or exterior facade materials on an existing commercial building. And what we're doing is checking to meet the requirements for that. If you're doing landscaping and tree removal changes for commercial property, or if you're just repaving a parking lot or something like that, we're going to check it to make sure that you're not adding spaces. It's not that you can't add spaces, it's just that that's a higher level of review and can't be issued over the counter. So those are examples of type 1 non-residential permits. Next slide. So the typical land use review process that requires public notice and comment, majority of these are done at a type 2 level. We call this a limited land use decision. It's the type of decision that is the community development director's domain and her staff, so we can issue these as staff if it meets the criteria. There's no public hearing associated with this. There are code requirements, et cetera. We write a staff report, and if it meets the criteria, we can approve it. There's usually conditions of approval associated with these to fulfill as you go through the process. Next slide. Examples be a new multifamily structure, new commercial building, or a land division, which is a partition up to 3 lots, or subdivision, which is 4 or more lots. Next slide. Type 2 review process. You'll see this a lot. By state law, any type 2 or higher decision must be made by the city within 120 days of a completed application. So the first step for us and for the applicant is what's called a pre-application conference. We sit down, we go through your initial proposal, we talk through it, we give you a written summary of what the process and code requirements are, and engineering also weighs in on public improvements and transportation and that sort of thing. Then once the application is submitted, we check it for completeness within 30 days. If it's incomplete, we'll give you a written list of things to complete. And once it's deemed complete, now you're in a 120-day deadline. The applicant controls this deadline. If it looks like we're bumping up to the end of this 120-day process, we have to be in very close communication with the applicant, make sure that we stay within the land use process, and they can sometimes grant an extension. Most of the time, we issue a decision within about 60 days of this, because we have to allow, once we've issued a decision, we have to allow time for public notice, and then once the decision can be appealed to the city commission, and there needs to be a time period for a public hearing and notice on that. I won't go into that process, appeal process, but it does exist. Next slide. Type 3 reviews, examples would be if the use is not permitted by right in the zone, like a single-family development in a residential zone is a by right use. It doesn't require any kind of special review, but a school or an institutional use within a residential zone might require conditional use. If an applicant wants to phase a development for up to 20 years, it requires a little more discretion. That's called a master plan. A variance from the code or a code interpretation which requires discretion is a type 3 review. And the Planning Commission is the decision maker in this case. So there's a public hearing, staff's providing a recommendation, but the Planning Commission is making that decision. Next slide. Example of that would be new school in a residential zone. That's a conditional use. So there are discretionary criteria. These don't say your school has to be a certain size or anything like that. They're looking at the general characteristics of the site, whether it's suitable for that use, what the impacts of that use are on the surrounding residential area, and if that use is going to impair the principal uses of that zone. And it must satisfy the relevant goals and policies of the comprehensive plan. So these are very discretionary criteria. They require what's called a quasi-judicial public hearing, which is what the Planning Commission is doing. They're essentially weighing this argument that the applicant's making and then making a majority vote on whether it meets those criteria. It also has to meet, you know, the general zoning and all of that stuff, but the conditional use criteria are the discretionary criteria that apply. Next slide. Same process as type 2, 120-day deadline. Difference is there's a public hearing at around day 60, and that requires 20 days notice. We provide notice on the website, through mailings, through email, and through a project web page that we put up. We write a staff report with recommendation and then Planning Commission decision, and that also can be appealed to the City Commission. Next slide. Finally, there's a type 4 review. This is for things where the applicant's seeking to change the zone. So if, for example, I'll give you an example, and sometimes that zone change, they're seeking to change this map, but sometimes this map will not allow a use unless you also change the comprehensive plan. So, for example, this pink area here is Clackamas County campus right over here. And if someone wanted to put a residential use in here, it would require a rezone. But it would also require a comprehensive plan amendment because it's an institutional comp land designation. So, next slide. Example B, you rezoning a 20-acre parcel from residential to campus industrial. That would be, we have a campus industrial zone by the college, this purple area, and we have some residential areas next to it, this yellow stuff. If you wanted to rezone 20 acres of that to match this, it would be a type 4 review. We're looking at public utilities and whether they can support that use, and does it meet our transportation system plan, and can the transportation system handle those new trips of vehicle trips. So that's an example of a type 4 decision. Next slide. That's the end of the general land use. Does anybody have any questions at this point? If not, I'm going to go into the natural resource. Yes, sir.
Just something that happened this last couple of days, Metro, or not Metro, state legislature approving the urban growth boundary and affordable housing and 30% of that. There, my opinion, I have a little background in the urban growth boundary. Are the cities going to have to match the goals, go 1 through 13, to get those expansions done? Because let's use South End Road or some of the other areas that don't have transportation.
Yeah. Well, Oregon City's urban growth boundary is probably not moving for some time because we still have a lot of land within our UGB that has not been annexed to the city yet and has not been developed. So I don't know if, at least in the case of Oregon City, I don't know if there's a desire to change the UGB at this point. The City Commission would make that decision. So getting into the overlay districts, the first one I'm talking about is the Natural Resources Overlay District. So there's a chapter of code, chapter 1749, that governs this. The purpose of this district is to protect inventoried streams, wetlands, and high-value habitat areas. So when we say inventoried, we mean that there's a map that's been adopted by the city based on our best available information as to where these sensitive areas are within the city. This implements various statewide planning goals and also Metro's urban growth plan, Title III for water quality and flood management, and nature in the neighborhoods. So this is a habitat one. This is water quality and floods. Next slide. So within that chapter, if you go and read it, it defines what uses in the underlying zone are. Any use in the underlying zone is permitted within the Natural Resource Overlay District. This is like a floating regulatory layer in certain areas of the city. It does define certain exempt uses, and I'll give you examples of this. Prohibited and allowed uses. It allows limited development near these sensitive areas, provided that there's an analysis done and mitigation. I'll talk about that. It is generally a type 2 process, a staff level decision. If someone wants to vary from the standards of the overlay, it would be a type 3 discretionary review. And it has specific areas that pertain to types of development like land divisions, existing structures, utilities, trails, roads, and other things. So, next slide. This is, you can't see this, but there's a big map, Natural Resource Overlay District adopted map. It also is on our GIS online, OC web map, so you can go and turn it on and see where it is on a particular parcel. It's adopted by the City Commission. It's based on a local wetland and stream inventory from 1999, LiDAR data, which is satellite information, our GIS and slope data. Because it's fairly old, it may not reflect existing conditions, so it's incumbent on a land use application to do a site-specific survey to show exactly where the resource is. It also doesn't indicate where we've done prior reviews and approvals on the map. You would need to talk to us to see whether a property nearby has been approved or that sort of thing. But we can certainly provide that information. There may be permits from other agencies. For example, a wetland is subject to review by the Department of State Lands if it's over a certain size. And the Corps of Engineers controls certain streams if they are navigable waters, and that's a whole other thing. But an applicant's separately responsible for communicating with those agencies. We don't do that permitting part of it. That's up to them. Our last update to this map was done in 2020. Next slide. Examples of application types are basically 3 types. There's an exemption, type 1. There's something called a verification, which can also be a type 1. Sometimes a type 2, but often a type 1. And then the general type 2 application. Type 1 allows certain uses without having to file for a verification or a full application. That would include doing habitat enhancement, responding to an emergency, repair and replacement of any existing structure or garden. So if your house or your deck or your garden existed prior to the enactment of this natural resource district, it can continue in perpetuity and be repaired, and in some cases, completely replaced, rearranged, as long as you're not changing the general square footage of the impervious surface. And removal of hazardous and dead trees. There are about 20 other specific exemptions listed in this code section that you can apply for, and it's about a $100 fee for that. Verification is a process where you're asking the city to confirm the exact location of a stream or wetland on a property. That can be type 1 or 2. If staff can do it by relying on existing information, we can go out to the site and do a quick survey, check some boxes, look at prior permits and approvals, and then based on that location, you can either say that project is completely outside of that district, the overlay, or if it can't be verified at a type 1 level, it might bump it up to this. So type 2 application, subject to the NROD chapter and its mitigation requirements. It has to be prepared by a qualified professional, such as a wetland scientist. We probably do about 3 or 4 type 2 applications a year, and they're usually combined with another development application. So, next slide. The NROD buffer or vegetative corridor is this pink overlay shown here. Here you got Abernathy Creek. Abernathy Creek is a salmon-bearing stream, so it has a required minimum vegetative corridor width of 200 feet. Within that boundary, you are allowed to develop, but mitigation would be required. If this stream was not a perennial salmon-bearing stream and was just an intermittent stream, the buffer can be shrunk down to 15 feet. So the width of that habitat and vegetative corridor area depends on the quality of that resource. And if you impact, let's say you impact 100 square feet of this, the code requires that you do 200 square feet of native plantings as mitigation somewhere on the development site. So that's a 2-to-1 ratio of planting area or mitigation area to impacted area. Next slide. Example of a verification. Here's an example that is just down Warner Milne. The application was to do a multifamily development. Sorry, I'm going to stand over here. There is a stream indicated on our map as a permanent stream that runs from Cam Street down to here. Up above Cam Street's been culverted, and it's basically an open ditch until it gets to Warner Milne Road, and then there's a culvert there. So, but it shows up as a stream on our regulatory map. So the verification process, applicant hired a consultant, wetland scientist, looked at that, determined that the stream is an ephemeral drainage, which isn't regulated, and they were basically able to entirely remove the NROD from this development. They did keep the open swale down here on Warner Milne, and that basically allowed full development of the site. This development has not been constructed yet, but they do have an approval to do that. That's right. Next slide. This is an example of exemption. This is a project that the City Public Works Department had to do up in Park Place. This is the existing condition. So it's an eroded ravine with a stream in it. There's a house 22 feet from the edge of it. This failing structure needed to be completely replaced. So they added riprap and stabilized the sides of this bank and planted trees and shrubs. And under the code, that was considered repair and replacement of existing structure and improvement of habitat, because as you can see, there's a lot of blackberries and vines and things. So planting the native species is actually considered an enhancement of that area. So that was an exemption. Next slide. Here's a type 2 example. Mud Creek, it flows through the Clackamas County campus over there. It's within the NROD. The courthouse project that's being constructed right now needed to construct a stormwater, or actually replace a stormwater pipe that drains partially into the area near the stream. So that was a rock line dispersion channel. It would be a permanent encroachment in the NROD. Mitigation has to be provided at a 2-to-1 ratio. The impact area was 180 square feet, so they proposed 360 square feet of native planting in this corridor. That was 5 trees and 25 shrubs, because it's based on area and basically a mathematical calculation and a planting plan. So that's that part. There is for residential areas and for commercial as well, but I'm going to talk about residential, something called a density transfer within the natural resources. Quite an incentive. It allows for up to a third of the allowable density that would otherwise be allowed to be transferred to areas outside the NROD. So it also provides for, if you have a minimum lot size in a zone that's specified in the R10 zone, the minimum lot size is 10,000 square feet. The NROD will allow your lots to be half that size in order to accommodate these habitat areas and significantly shrink down the size of the lots. It is a type 2 process, so there is going to be public notice and comment on this process. We don't see a lot of people taking advantage of this. It's very clear and objective. There's a set of tables for how much the setbacks can shrink and how small the lots can get in order to protect that resource. So that is in the code, and it does add back significant development area to these areas that would otherwise be off limits to development. Next slide. Can you vary from the standards? Yes, you can. That is a type 3 review. Planning Commission would make the decision on that based on a recommendation from staff. And the city also has a natural resources consultant who reviews these types of applications to make sure that they conform with the necessary requirements that are governing this, because we don't have an environmental specialist on staff. We rely on the applicant's consultant to show that they meet Corps of Engineers methodology and the proper techniques for delineating a wetland and all of that, which is governed by the state. Final slide. Yeah, that's it for the Natural Resources District. Thank you. It's in 1749, chapter 1749, under density transfer. Yeah.
All right. So again, my name is Josh Wheeler. I've been with the city since 2018. I've been in Oregon since 2014, but I've always been in development in my whole career since 1999. Started on the private side, so I know what the engineers do in design and how they have to meet those city regulations. And now my staff are the ones who enforce those regulations, so I've seen it from both sides. So I'm talking about geologic hazards today, and there's two ways we can define this. One is a general item, an adverse geologic condition capable of causing damage or loss of property or life. The Oregon City Municipal Code, Chapter 1744, generally defines a geologic hazard as a slope of 25% or greater, which has a 50-foot buffer, or a landslide deposit, which has a 200-foot buffer. So the slopes are based on LiDAR data, which is satellite photography. There is error in that, and so we do allow on-the-ground surveys to determine the actual slope on site. With respect to the landslide deposits, those are based on information provided by the Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, DOGAMI, in the state, and those are not revisable in any way. What those say is what they are. These are all the geologic hazards in Oregon City, and the pink line here is the city limits. The purple line on the outside is the urban growth boundary. You'll see that the yellow is all types of geologic hazards, from slopes to landslides, and the Kenema area is full of that. The Newell Creek area is full of that, and then around the edges and through the McLaughlin neighborhood. One thing that you'll find is that the landslides often are in the same locations as a steep slope, but not always, and especially in the McLaughlin area because of the varying bluffs and areas of basalt that we have. There are a lot more slopes that are only slopes in that area. And I'm going to show that on the next slide, I believe. Absolutely. Yep. So we are currently right here in the middle of the city. That's where we are today. Um, Again, this is the Kanema neighborhood, so 99E and the Willamette River. This is the McLaughlin neighborhood. Home Depot is up here in the corner. This is Clackamas Cove up here. Park Place neighborhood at the top. This takes you down Malala Avenue. 213 goes through there and connects down to Beaver Creek down here, our south side, where Oregon City Golf Course is down here. And then you've seen a lot of new subdivisions over the last 10 to 20 years get constructed in this whole area over Central Point, Leland, and Pease Roads in that area. So looking at the steep slopes themselves, this is the steep slope map. You've got the slopes which are 25% or greater, and you've got a buffer of 50 feet to all those. The reason for the buffer is that that is there because that LiDAR data is the best data we have, but there is error in that, and so the 50 feet takes that approximation away. But as I said before, we do allow a on-the-ground survey, which is much more accurate, to take place of that, and it just needs to be shown to us, and we have to agree to it. The next slide. These are those landslide deposits, and what is a landslide deposit? It is generally something from hundreds of years ago, from glacial deposits that have come down over time and sat in place. And in those cases, those are not part of the geologic makeup of the whole area. So if you're going down 10, 20, 50, 100, 200 feet, that's where some of these deposits are, and they are susceptible to move at any time. They typically move because of water. So the rainwater that we get is hitting the ground, it's going way deep into the ground, and then it's loading or adding to the weight of the ground there and having that area move. Some areas I want to bring to your attention, over here on Beaver Creek, let's see, right in this area, this is Forest Edge Apartments. That moved back in 2015, I believe was the date, Christmas Eve of 2015. It also moved a few times prior to that, but in 2015 we had to evacuate apartments because of slides happening there. That has since been put back into place. The person that bought the apartment complex renovated the whole complex. They added dewatering systems, which kept that water from going into the ground anymore and allowed it to be at very low risk of removal, of moving. The Kanema neighborhood, as I mentioned, is one big geologic hazard. We have not seen slides over there, but we do consider that a very high-risk area. Another area that has moved over time is the Peter Skeen neighborhood. We've had issues in that neighborhood from sanitary sewers breaking to water mains breaking. And there was a development that was put there in the 1970s that we haven't seen slides of houses at this point, but we are very limited on developing that area further at this time. And then you'll also note up here near the hospital, we have Trillium Drive up there. There was a subdivision put in. That road was closed back in 2019, I believe it was, and we did a improvement there in 2021, 2022 that kept the road closed but put a pedestrian path in, and we did lose a house in that area with that slide. So, why did we allow these things in the past? We didn't have the science. The science of geologic hazards really has come a long way from about the year 2000. But prior to the year 2000, a lot of these things were built. We didn't have the data at the time, and now we have it, and so we're much more conservative about that. The other thing I want to say about geologic hazards is that while it is more constraining, and you're going to see the constraints here in a second, I also see these as opportunities to protect life, opportunities to retain land as being undeveloped, which makes it more natural and much more aesthetically pleasing in many cases. And while it may not be as densified as some may desire, it's a way to let those properties remain in a much more natural state. So I went over some of this history. The Forest Edge Apartments were originally done in 1999. They had to close in 2015 and were reopened in 2021 or 22. We did a substantial code revision in 2010, which made a lot of new regulations to the code. We updated that code in 2021 based on some criteria and things that we were struggling to clearly implement, trying to make those criteria more clear. And we're going through an update right now to actually add one more clarification. That one is also for clarity, but also we are looking to update our maps because we've got new map data from Dogami that's come in that we have added to our mapping system. We also have that I said a surveyor could tell us that our survey is not as accurate and they're more accurate. We're trying to put clarifications in that prevent someone from going through that type 2 review that Pete talked about and bring it down to a type 1, and we're working to find a way to make that a little easier on people developing land or people that own a property that want to do an addition like a bedroom or things like that. One thing I didn't say early on was that geologic hazards goes through a type 2 process, so it goes through that 120-day process that Pete talked about, unless you have certain exemptions, which I'm going to go through. The other area that I did not mention, South End Road, the county owns that road, a part of that road anyway, and they did a stabilization project in 2022, because if you went down that road, you would have seen cracks in it, and it was going to slide off the hill. We did a community forum. You can see a whole thing about geologic hazards that goes on for an hour or more on our website, and there's a video for that. And then Waterboard Park, which is an area kind of in the center of the city as well. That area has been sliding for many years, and we are looking to see what we're going to do with that to develop it into a park. It was historically a park decades ago, and it's now been redefined as a park, but currently it's just neutral land at this point. Right. So when you have to go through the type 2 review, what are the basics? You need a geotechnical engineering report done by a geotechnical engineer, could be a civil engineer, could be a geologist, but someone with a license from the state of Oregon. You need to minimize cuts and fills, so you should not be digging big swaths of land or adding big amounts of land to the area. We're trying to minimize the disturbance. Those earth disturbing activities should only occur between May 1st and October 31st of every year, with some small caveats to that, but again, these are the basics. The picture to the right, by the way, is Trillium Drive. And then we also require indemnity agreements because geologic hazards can never be eliminated. Once you own a property with geologic hazards, you will always have geologic hazards no matter what type of mitigation you do or what type of protections you do. The risk will always exist. The goal of the process is to minimize that risk. But since we cannot eliminate it, the city requires these indemnity agreements to say that we did our best in allowing you to develop your land, but we cannot get rid of your risk. Therefore, if something occurs, that is on you, not the city. So that's why we have those. So are there any ways to prevent you from having to go through a geologic hazard when there are mapped areas on your property? If you are digging less than 2 feet, sometimes we call that a cut, sometimes we call that an excavation, you are exempt. If you are filling less than 2 feet, adding dirt to your site, you are exempt. If you are building a structure or maybe an addition to your property, less than 500 square feet, you're exempt. Utility lines, if you're doing a sewer extension in a road and it's through a geologic hazard area, that is exempt. Reason being, that area was already previously disturbed, and so therefore it makes sense it's okay to disturb it again. The one that's a little tricky is 25% of tree canopy removal. So if your lot is fully developed with trees and you're taking away all the trees, that would not be exempt, but you're only taking a small amount of them away, you would be exempt. Anytime you're getting rid of weeds or invasive species, you're exempt. But that's only taking the weeds away. That's not scraping a bunch of land everywhere. And then we have an emergency caveat, which is anytime that you are in imminent danger of failure, or possibly even something like you're on septic and you need to put a sewer in, we work with you to make sure that you're doing that in a safe way, but we want to get those fixed before they become even bigger problems. Now, one question might be, well, what if I'm, cutting a lot, but I'm not filling a lot? You would not be exempt. So you have to meet every single criteria, not just one of the criteria separately. You need to meet them all to be exempt. Where do you find these standards? We mentioned Oregon City Municipal Code 1744 earlier. More standards that are important. Again, you want to minimize those cuts and fills. You also want to minimize retaining walls. But the other two items that are probably key is density and disturbance. So you want to limit the density to 2 dwelling units per acre. If your property is less than an acre, you're only allowed 1 dwelling unit. What is a dwelling unit? As defined by our code, a dwelling unit is an area for one family to live. And so, for example, if you have a duplex, that is 2 dwelling units. If you have a single family house, that is 1 dwelling unit no matter how many people are living in there. If you are a subdivision of 6 units, that is 6 dwelling units. So even though you may be able to fit in from a zoning standpoint, 6, 7, 10 units, geologic hazards will say no, you can only do 1 or 2 dwelling units depending on the size of your lot. So this is more constraining than the regular zoning. You also have to limit your disturbance, so that impact to the earth. You're limited to 4,000 square feet of earth disturbance or 50% of the size of the lot, whichever is smaller. This means if you have a 1 acre lot full of geologic hazards, the maximum amount of disturbance is 4,000 square feet. That seems very limiting, but the reason is if you disturb it, you're going to have the potential to slide. Here are a couple examples. Let's say you have a 1.5 acre lot. You would be allowed 2 units, but only 4,000 square feet of disturbance. In the example of a really small lot, a 6,000 square foot lot, you would only be allowed 1 unit, but 3,000 square feet because it's 50% the size of the lot. So while it, again, can be very constraining, it also is an opportunity to ensure that we keep life and hazards in line. We have a lot of resources on this. These are all links for various things. But what I also like is this picture that I've put at the side. These are 4 types of landslides, and when you think of a landslide, you think of these items that you see on YouTube or on the news where something catastrophic is happening. That is really not what happens in Oregon City. What happens in Oregon City, one item, is the tilting of trees. There was a picture earlier from Pete in the Enrod. That was the Beamer Way outfall that he was talking about. Not only was that an Enrod situation, it was also a geologic hazard situation. We felt that was imminently about to erode and fall, and the reason was trees were angling, falling over into the ravine. We needed to correct that problem as quick as humanly possible once we became aware of it. So it went through an emergency review rather than the type 2 review. The formation of cracks in a yard, driveway, sidewalk foundation, that happened in Trillium Drive and South End Road. Those are ones that happened and showed that something is happening underneath. We should do something about it. Number 3 says sudden difficulty opening or closing doors or windows. That happened in the Forest Edge Apartments. When that slid, there was actually a big slough, which was early on that I didn't point out on our second slide, I believe. But it also not only caused a big slough of land, it also caused foundation settlement, which caused doors and windows not to open. And then number 4 is sagging utility lines and leaking or broken water pipes. This happened in the Trillium area as well as the Peter Skeen area with broken sewers and broken water mains because of movement of land. So those are the things that happen in Oregon City that you should be aware about. Could we have a catastrophe? Anything's possible. But the reality is that these are the signs of what happens in Oregon City. And if you see those signs, you can do something about it before the catastrophe happens. That is it on geologic hazards. Any questions on? Yes?
So I drive by that house on South End as you're going down the hill
Mhm.
daily. And I'm pretty sure people don't live there now. Is that because those trees started to like shift over on, and it's a hazard?
So the question is dealing with South End Road, and about halfway from the top of the hill to the bottom of the hill, you go around the curve. There is a house that appears to be uninhabited. Um, that is in a geologic hazard area. They have had slides happen in that area. They also had storm damage, which caused trees to fall on the house, which may or may not have been caused from geologic hazards. Um, that has a longer story to it of how we're working with them to see if we can rehabilitate that house in any way. But there's a number of other issues going on with that property. Yep. Any other questions about geologic hazards? All right, I think next up is historic.
So before I start, has anybody tried to sell or buy an historic home in Oregon City? Anybody? Okay. So if you haven't, my goal here is to just give you kind of the background. Some people think it's a little scary or, oh, my client shouldn't buy this. But as long as you understand, I think kind of a lot what Pete and Josh is saying, if you understand the regulation and kind of the sideboards, then your client can understand if they want to purchase the house. Next slide. So Oregon City, not surprisingly, has a pretty robust historic preservation program. We have about 500 resources that we protect through regulation, and we have 2 historic districts. This is a common slide you'll see also from Pete. We start at the state, right, for the land use goals, and which looks at inventorying and protecting historic resources. We have a comprehensive plan. In Oregon City, we are also a certified local government, which means we're recognized by the State Historic Preservation Office of having a preservation program. We get grants. We try to have education programs like this. We have an historic overlay district, so that's chapter 1740. That's where our code is. But in Oregon City, we also have adopted design guidelines and policies that further provide direction. Our municipal code, 1740, is a little more big picture and vague. You really get down to the specifics when you get into the design guidelines and the policies. So as I explained, we have 2 historic districts, and then we call landmarks, which are designated properties kind of sprinkled throughout the city. So there is a little bit different between our 2 historic districts. McLaughlin is a conservation district, and that is generally the area kind of on that second bench of Oregon City, where City Hall is, before you get past Eastham School, where 7th Street turns into Malala. It's about north and south of 7th Street. That is a conservation district, so in the early 1980s, when the city was putting together their preservation program, there wasn't quite agreement to regulate every single house all the same in the McLaughlin district, and so they individually designated about 300 of the 1,000 tax lots. And so what that means, I'll get into future slides, is depending on if you're individually designated or you're not, there may be different regulations inside the McLaughlin district. So it always is good to have that due diligence to understand what category you fall into. The Kenema National Register District, that's the small community that was a separate city actually until 1928, but it is just kind of south Oregon City as you head out to Canby. That is a National Register District, which means every single resource is regulated. It's almost like every single one was individually designated. Then we have landmarks, which are individually designated properties throughout the city. So you'll have some on farmhouses out in South End. Park Place has a few, definitely a fair amount of resources. And these are just kind of, in a sense, little historic tax lots. We also have the Barlow Road that goes through Park Place. That is the kind of end of the Oregon Trail. That's instead of taking the Columbia down to the Willamette at the end when you hit the Dalles, you went around Mount Hood, took the Barlow Road, and really the last 2 or 3 miles of the Barlow Road are in Oregon City. In the early 90s, the city created the Barlow Road Visual Corridor, so if there's a couple resources in the Park Place area, if you do redevelopment, you have to ensure that there's a 30-foot visual corridor. It's not a trail or pedestrian connection, but you do have to have a visual corridor of that route. And there's some tax lots left, but there's some, not a lot. So the Kenema National Register District, as I explained, this is, if I was over here, Willamette Falls will be here. We'll be taking the highway down to Canby. This is Old Kenema Park. This is kind of the McLaughlin district up here. And if you've gone to Metro's Kenema Park, that's over here. So this is just shows kind of all the different historic structures in Kenema. So what triggers review in Kenema? If you have an addition to any building, that potentially can have either a staff level review or a public hearing. Any new construction over 200 square feet, if it's under 200 square feet, you can work with staff. If it's over, that's going in front of the Historic Review Board. And alterations to historic resources that don't meet the guidelines. And we'll talk about the guidelines in future. That would have to go to a hearing. Next slide. So this is the McLaughlin Conservation District. That's that kind of hybrid district. The boundaries are kind of down south by Waterboard Park. And this would be the McLaughlin Promenade and the end of the Oregon Trail Museum, the Museum of the Oregon Territory, which is the Clackamas County Historic Society, is right here. We have City Hall, which is about right here, and Oregon City High School is just outside of the boundary, the old Oregon City High School in the field. It heads up to about that bend in 7th Street, which turns into Malal Avenue, where Eastham School is. So that's generally, it takes most of the 7th Street corridor, is kind of the spine of the McLaughlin Conservation District. Next slide. So what triggers review in McLaughlin? So if you have a property that is for sale, you'll want to, either if you're representing a seller or your buyer is interested, you'll want to find out, is this individually designated or not in McLaughlin? And you can call up our staff, we can let you know, and we'll talk at the end kind of the best ways to due diligence with our staff. And we love it when people call us, so never think that we are bothered if you ask questions. We love due diligence. We love people asking proactive questions. We have our 2 assistant planners who are every day answering questions via email and are happy to do that research for you. So find out if you are a locally designated resource. If you are not a resource, then you can make changes to your house on the exterior like you were any other home in Oregon City. Gate permits as needed, but there is no review for exterior alterations or additions under 30% of the size of the house. So you want to do, a new bedroom, or you want to reconfigure things. If you're not individually designated in McLaughlin, you don't need a historic review. If you want to do a large addition and add, 2,000 more square feet, that gets triggered for review because we want to make sure that the new construction or large additions don't impact the historic nature of the district. Any new construction over 200 square feet, so you want to build a new 2-car garage in your backyard, there will be some review. Or if you buy a vacant lot, then there is some review. And then alterations, so if you are an historically designated resource, so let's say you're the other category, exterior alterations that go beyond repair and maintenance do get a level of review on staff if you meet the design guidelines, which I'll talk about. If you can't meet the design guidelines or you don't want to meet the design guidelines and you want to make your case to the Historic Review Board, they do review that every once in a while, and that is a public hearing. Next slide. So policies. Over the last 40-odd years that there's been a preservation program, it used to be that every single thing a property owner did had to go in front of our Historic Review Board, and they were getting like 30 and 40 applications a year, and that's too much for a volunteer group, and it's also creates really big barriers for property owners who are just doing little things for their property. And so they created policies over the years, and those can be things like foundation construction, windows and doors, fences, decks, solar panels, all that kind of the day-to-day stuff you do as a property owner. And these are available online, and here's an example of one. This is talks about repair foundations and windows. You can move forward and not get any Historic Review Board approval if you meet the policy. So get your building permits as needed, and you are fine, good to go. You can do that on a type 1 level, or sometimes you don't even need to reach out to staff if it's just obvious that you're meeting it. Next slide. So we have kind of different levels. If, let's say you're doing a project where you are replacing your window, on your historic resource. And you read the policy, and basically the policy talks about how windows are so important to the historic significance of a building, and changing out to vinyl windows really will adversely affect kind of the nature of the historic building. So our board really wants to make sure that people repair their historic wood windows if they can, and if they can't, replace it with a new wood window or maybe an aluminum clad wood window. So you're looking through the policies and you're like, okay, I think I meet it, but I want to check with staff. We're more than happy to write an email back agreeing with you. You can put it in your file and you're good to go. Maybe you're building a fence and you check our fence policies and it says the front yard, you can have a 3.5-foot picket fence or a 3.5-foot wood fence. You're looking at the picture, you're looking at your fence. You don't need to call us if it's obvious that you meet it, because there's no permit, you're fine. But we really do encourage, if people are curious or they think they meet it or they have questions, once again, contact our staff. We're happy to put something in email, and that's what people keep in their file. So that's up here. So if no permit is needed, we're happy to do a review for you, but you don't have to if it's really clear that you meet it. If you're, let's say you're doing a building permit, let's say you're doing a change, but it does also require a building permit, staff will just review it through the building permit process. And then projects that don't meet the policies, but you think, I have a weird case or I have this specific situation, I want to go in front of the Historic Review Board and explain. You can, the cost is $50 plus $20 for mailing labels, so it's not the cost burden to go in front of the Historic Review Board. They meet once a month. And sometimes they do approve projects that don't meet the policies because you have a unique situation. Sometimes they don't. It really depends. Next slide. So the other kind of piece of being in a historic district is new construction. So I have a vacant lot, or I'm making a large addition, or maybe a new standalone accessory building. We have design guidelines in both districts and landmarks that kind of explain how to have a building that is compatible, which people kind of say, well, what does compatible mean? It's that it blends but does not fake history, right? This is not Colonial Williamsburg. We're not making you build a replica historic home, but we want to make sure that the new construction is balanced and doesn't overtake or take away from the historic building. Think of it kind of like a jewels on a necklace. You want to be proud and see your historic resources as the main pieces of a district. You want a new construction to be kind of secondary and kind of blend in. So we look at size, massing, architectural style, make sure that there's not Frankenstein style. You don't put 3 different architectural styles on one building so it's confusing, or take a plan from Louisiana and try to build, a type of architecture that doesn't exist in Oregon City. So real quickly, we have a very large document. You can go through it with staff if you have a client who's interested in doing new construction. In McLaughlin, we really look at commercial. We look at more kind of streetcar commercial, what you see on 7th Street. In residential, we have 3 types in McLaughlin, and I'll show pictures in the next slide. It's vernacular, or like Western farmhouse, bungalow, and Queen Anne. In Kenema, there are no Queen Anne examples, so it's bungalow and vernacular. Next slide. So here's some examples of the historic resources, not the new construction, but vernacular is, I call it vernacular with a capital V. That's really your 19th century, kind of 1880s to 1890s Western farmhouse. It is a very symmetrical building. It usually has it's a 1.5-story building. So that second story is not a full built-out story. It often has a 412 roof pitch. And you'll see that a lot. That's kind of the bread and butter of historic homes in Oregon City, is vernacular. The next is bungalow. So that's kind of, you think of arts and crafts, that's the high style. That's the kind of fancy green and green homes you'd see in Pasadena, California. Well, they all got translated, like for the Sears and Roebuck kit homes, into more bungalow. So bungalow is more of the workers' cottages. And so this is an example of the bungalow style. Those are your more kind of 1915 to 1930 in Oregon City. And then we have Queen Anne and Queen Anne vernacular. So in our McLaughlin district, Queen Anne's are a lot more ornamentation. They're asymmetrical. They have 2 full stories. So if someone wants to build a really big house, you can get more in a Queen Anne than you can in a vernacular bungalow. And then we have the kind of simpler style, which is Queen Anne vernacular. Next slide. So I gave you all this regulation about all these things you need to do to be an historic property owner, extra regulation on windows and siding and maintenance. Those are all carrots. We have one little, those are all sticks. We have one little carrot, and that's our preservation grant program. We give out 5 $1,000 grants a year to historic property owners for window repair, siding repair, foundation repair, porch repair, architectural element, replication. And it's a matching grant, so if you have $2,000 project, you can get up to $1,000. It's a reimbursement. You have to get 2 bids. Present. It's a rolling grant, so you can present any month the board has a hearing, and if we have grants available. And we like to see people do multiple grants over the course of the year. So we've had historic homeowners who just did 2 windows and they repaired their historic wood windows. And then the next year they did 2 more, and they just kind of worked around their house. And that grant for window can pay for reglazing, rehanging weights. It can help pay for, maybe your whole window is just painted shut and you just want to get a better handle of how to repurpose it. We also pay 25% for the cost of interior or exterior storm windows. So that is an option for folks. If you're just doing materials and you're doing your own labor, we'll pay for materials. If you're hiring a contractor that's licensed by the state of Oregon, we can do labor and materials. Up to 1,000. It's not a lot, but that's why we tell for property owners, this is not going to pay for your big rehab, but especially if property owners are okay and they would just kind of want to work on little projects, this helps. Next. So where do you find all this information? In the planning department, we have a historic preservation tab. You want to do there's a little plus button right there. You do plus, and there's lots of information. You can get the survey forms for all the historic resources. You can get the design guidelines. You can get the process. You can get the grant applications. We have the deadlines of when something needs to be turned in for each month. So there's all of our preservation resources are there. As always, feel free to contact our planning staff. We're happy to help. Generally, if you're just doing a residential historic project and there's no natural resource overlay or geologic hazards, we don't require a pre-application conference, but we love to meet with staff for free. The earlier in your design process, the better. So we do free one-on-one meetings, either in person or over Zoom or Teams. We're happy to do that. Next slide. So that's my information, that's me, Christina Robertson. But we also have our planning staff and our assistant planners review kind of planner on duty questions all day long, and they do get a lot of historic resource questions that they can answer. We are here Monday through Thursday, 9 to 4, and Friday by appointment, so you can always pop in as well. And any historic preservation questions will also be available after our presentation if you want to get into like my property, this.
So, somebody wants to paint their house, that's part of what they have to do.
Yeah, that's a good question. Because painting doesn't require a permit, and we have a staff of 4 people in planning, that's just a level of regulation we can't do in Oregon City. And so painting does not require any review. And we also see that as temporary. Like you could paint your whole house Pepto-Bismol pink, no one's gonna like it, but you can always, like a new owner could repaint it, because it's not it's not an irretrievable loss of integrity, right? Because you can always repaint it. Things that really the city is regulating are things that you are doing that irretrievably could affect, like I'm gonna take all my windows and put vinyl windows in, or I'm gonna take out all my siding and put vinyl siding on, or I'm gonna strip out all the architectural elements on the outside of my Queen Anne to make it, more slimlined and more modern. Like those are the kind of things that are regulated because future owners can't go back and fix your mistakes because you've taken it away. So I have a very quick overlay. People forget about this one. I only have one slide. We have a thing called the Willamette River Greenway. It was created in the early 70s by, established in 67 by Tom McCall and implemented in the early 70s with Bob Straub. Any of the old Oregon people know those names. It was pretty revolutionary in the early 70s. It's about protecting our shoreline. What we have nowadays is so much more overlay districts, so things like natural resource and geologic hazards and our codes. We kind of implement the Willamette River Greenway through a lot of other things, If you develop on the Willamette River Greenway, you need to have public access between private development and the river. So like things like the River Shore Hotel, right? You need public access between the two. We don't have a lot of resources, though it involves Kenema. So if you have a property in Kenema, there's also an extra Willamette River Greenway review, but it's not that complicated.
So yes, this is the fifth overlay today, and the thing to know about that is you may be in all 5 overlays, and if you are, there are 5 different regulations, and sometimes the regulations may conflict with one another, so you really have to work with staff to figure out what is the priority and what level each one is. But for floodplain, floodplain is the land area identified and designated by the United States Army Corps of Engineers, Oregon Division of State Lands, FEMA, or the City of Oregon City, which has been or may be covered temporarily by water as a result of a storm event of an identified frequency, and it's usually the flat area of land adjacent to a stream or river formed by floods. I'm showing you 2 pictures here. The one on your left is the floodplain layer. This is Willamette River here, this is Clackamas River up here, and this is the Abernathy Creek there. Those are the areas of Oregon City which are designated floodplain areas. Why I'm showing you the picture on your right is those are all the various streams which may or may not have inrod related to them, but they do not have floodplain related to them. The reason that's important is a lot of people will say, well, those flood too, so why isn't there a protection about that? The reason is it's a much lower frequency, it's rare, but there are things you can do about that. The picture on your left, we are in a program that you'll see in a slide called the Community Rating System, which is part of FEMA's program. And you can get flood insurance for your property, no matter if you're in a floodplain or not. Used to be only in a floodplain. Now you can do it for any property. So right now in this floodplain here, you can get a 20% discount on your insurance because we are part of the CRS program. If you're in one of these areas, not in a floodplain, but next to a creek and you want flood insurance, you get a 10% discount now because you're part of our program. The 1996 flood is what determined the most recent floodplain in the city. You can see that it looks very similar to the shape you saw earlier. That's a picture of the 1996 flood over at 14th and Washington. Oregon City has had floods historically over the years. The big ones, 1894, 1948, 64, and 96, those are ones where they were more catastrophic floods. We've had others where the Willamette and Clackamas have overtaken their banks, but not as catastrophic as those. That's 1964 in the picture for 14th and Main Street. We have participated in that community rating system since 2005, so we've been doing that for a long time. So hopefully if you have properties in the floodplain, they've been taking advantage of that. But we recently moved from a rating 8 to a rating 6, which doubled that insurance discount. So that's something that the city now provides for. The regulations are found in the code 1742. If you fill that floodplain, you must excavate elsewhere to make sure you don't change the floodplain limits. In your building permit, you must have an elevation certificate or a floodplain certificate. We also may require indemnity agreements because we cannot prevent the flooding from happening. And there may be various design and construction standards that may also be required. Tons of references and resources available on our website as well as FEMA and DLCD and other people's websites. And I believe that is it.
Go for it.
Hey, Josh, I have a question. When did the geologic overlay hazard change, restricting the building envelope or building from what the zoning was to the two per acre?
So I do not know exactly when that changed, but I do know that a major code change was done in 2010, which made things much more highly regulated. And then since then, we've done clarifications. But 2010 was where we really got into those details.
Well, we really appreciate it. So thank you so much for coming. And do you have anything you want to say to wrap up? Okay,
No, thank
great.
you very much, everybody.
All right, thanks everyone.